The day Irene Alden rode into Caldwell, Kansas, she came in ahead of a dust storm, her hair loose and wild behind her, her rifle balanced across the saddle horn like she owned every inch of the prairie that stretched in every direction. And the first thing anyone who saw her thought was that no woman had any business looking that free. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell was a town that fancied itself civilized. It sat at the edge of the Kisham Trail, and the cattle drive still came through it like rivers of hide and horn. But the town had built a church the year before, and a schoolhouse the year before that, and the women who ran the ladies' auxiliary met every Thursday to discuss propriety, charity, and the moral improvement of their neighbors. They had curtains on their windows and bonnets on their heads and opinions about everything that moved within 50 miles. Irene Alden did not have a bonnet. She had a battered hat with a crow feather stuck through the band. She had leather gloves worn thin at the fingertips, a canvas coat that had seen 4 winters, and eyes the color of creek water after a hard rain, the kind of gray-green that could look almost brown in shadow and almost silver in direct sun. She was 24 years old. She had the kind of face that had been pretty once, and then had grown into something more than pretty, something that made people uncomfortable in ways they could not fully articulate, because it was the face of a woman who had learned to look at difficulty and not flinch. She tied her horse, a sturdy Grello mare named Cass, at the rail outside Donahue's general store, and she went inside to buy flour, coffee, and a tin of sulfur matches. The woman behind the counter was Mrs. Florence Donahue, who was the undisputed queen of the ladies' auxiliary and who had opinions about everything, including the newcomer currently walking through her door. "You looking for someone in town?" Mrs. Donahue asked, in the tone that meant she hoped the answer was no. "Looking to resupply," Irene said, "and I heard there might be work out at the Patterson Ranch." "The Patterson Ranch," Mrs. Donahue set down her ledger. "They run cattle and horses, not needlework." "I know what they run," Irene said pleasantly. "I can break horses." The silence that followed had a particular texture to it, the texture of a woman who had met something she did not have words for and was trying to find them quickly. "You're a horse breaker," Mrs. Donahue said finally, making it sound like a charge in court. "Among other things," Irene said. She bought her supplies. She walked back out into the dust. And as she untied Cass and swung up into the saddle with the easy confidence of someone who had spent more of her life on horseback than off it, she heard Mrs. Donahue's voice drift through the open door to whoever had come in behind her. "Too rough," the woman was saying. "Too rough by half for decent society. Some women are just built wrong for polite company, and that one's an example." Irene heard it. She did not stop riding. She had been hearing things like that for most of her life. She had been born in 1854 in Missouri, to a woman who ran a small farm alone after her husband went east to find work and never came back. Her mother, Della Alden, had been a practical woman out of necessity, a woman who could mend harness and dig fence post holes and doctor a sick cow. She had passed all of that on to her daughter, along with a love of open land and a deep, settled suspicion of people who measured a person's worth by how well they performed helplessness. Della had died of a fever when Irene was 17, and Irene had spent the years since moving west by degrees, working where work was offered, which was rarely in parlors or kitchens. She could outride most men she had met. She could track game. She could read weather in the sky and read horses in the way they held their ears and held their breath. She had worked on 3 different ranches in Missouri, 1 in Texas, and now she was in Kansas looking for the 4th. The Patterson spread was 11 miles south of Caldwell, and she reached it before supper. Howard Patterson was a square-built man of 50 with a permanent squint from 30 years of riding into morning sun, and he looked her up and down in a way that was measuring rather than rude, the look of a man thinking about practical things. "Herschel Cohn said you could ride," Patterson said. "Herschel Cohn is generous," Irene said. "I'm better than generous," Patterson almost smiled. "I got 7 horses that need working. 4 are green broke, 3 are not broke at all." I'll pay you $2 a head for the green ones and $3 for the wild ones. You board in the bunkhouse and eat at the main table. You done?" "I want $4 for the wild ones," Irene said. "And I want it understood that I work my own way, on my own schedule, and nobody interferes with my process." Patterson looked at her for a long moment. "$3.50. Done," Irene said. So she stayed. She had her own bunk at the end of the bunkhouse, separated from the rest of the hands by a half-wall Patterson had put up quickly with planed boards and a sense of awkward decorum. The hands were three men. A young Mexican vaquero named Tomás, who was 17, and treated her with a respect so careful it was almost ceremonial. An older man named Cleet, who had one good eye and did not seem interested in much beyond his supper and his sleep. And a man named DeVoe, who had opinions about women in workplaces and expressed them openly for 2 days, and then more quietly after Irene put a difficult stallion through his paces in front of the whole outfit and came away unhurt while the horse came away calm. She settled into the rhythm of the work, and the work was good. The wild horses were beautiful in their chaos, and she liked the negotiation of it, the slow conversation between her stillness and their fury, the way panic became curiosity became trust. She had always thought that horses were easier than people, because horses meant exactly what they communicated. There was no social performance in a horse, no gap between what was felt and what was expressed. It was on the 6th day that she first saw Gideon McCree. He came riding in from the north in the late afternoon, on a big red dun that moved like water over the uneven ground, and she was in the corral working the worst of the 3 wild horses when she heard the gate creak and saw Patterson come out of the house to greet the newcomer. She paid it only half her attention because the horse needed most of it, but she noticed things the way she always noticed things, quietly and completely, the way a person notices weather without deciding to. He was tall in the saddle, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate only what they needed, with dark hair that had grown past his collar, and a jaw that had not seen a razor in about a week. He wore a plain gray shirt and canvas trousers and boots that were worn but well kept, and he carried himself with the kind of ease that was not arrogance but something more fundamental, the ease of a man who had no particular fear of the opinion of others. She had the horse in hand now, doing the work she needed to do, and she did not stare, but she saw. An hour later at supper, Patterson introduced him. His name was Gideon McCree. He was 27 years old. He had worked cattle drives up from Texas for the last 4 years, and he was looking to stay put for a season, because he had it in mind to put some money aside and stop moving. Patterson had known his father in a different county in a different decade, and had given him a job on that basis, which was the kind of trust that still operated in the West in 1878, the trust of a man who had known your people. Gideon McCree sat down across from Irene at the long wooden table and looked at her with dark eyes that were direct without being aggressive, which was a combination she had encountered rarely enough to notice. "You're the horse breaker," he said. "That's right," she said. "Saw you in the corral with the gray. He's been hell for everyone who's tried." "He's not hell," she said. "He's frightened. They're different things." Gideon McCree was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's true," in a tone that suggested he was thinking about something other than horses. He reached for the bread. He did not make further observations, and Irene found after supper, when she was sitting outside on the bunkhouse step watching the first stars emerge above the plain, that she was thinking about him. She pushed the thought away. She was practical about many things, including herself. Over the following 2 weeks, they found their way toward each other the way 2 wary and independent people do, slowly, and with none of the grand gestures of a dime novel. He helped her carry a water barrel without being asked, and without making anything of it. She helped him with a piece of fence that had come down in a way that required 4 hands, and she gave the help without ceremony. They rode out together one morning to check the eastern water source, and they talked about the grass and the weather and the state of the range, and then they talked about other things, how she had come to this work, and how he had. His story was not simple. He had grown up in Georgia, the son of a man who had fought for the Confederacy and come home broken in ways that made the whole family pay for a war they hadn't started. He had left home at 18, moved west with nothing but a good horse and the knowledge of how to work, and he had worked. He had spent 2 years in Texas learning cattle from a rancher named Hollies, who was a fair man in a country that was not always fair, and he had driven cattle up the Kishom Trail 3 times, and he had seen things and done things and been places, and none of it had made him particularly hard, which she thought was unusual. Most men who have worked the trail come out of it rough, she said. They were walking the horses back across the flat land in the slanted gold light of late afternoon. Mean in a quiet way, like they've made a decision about people. I know what you mean, Gideon said. I've seen it. I just decided not to go that direction. It's not always a decision a person can make. No, he agreed. Sometimes circumstance pushes you. I was lucky in some of the people I found. She looked at him sidelong. You're an unusual kind of man. He looked back at her with that same steady directness. And you're an unusual kind of woman. It was not said the way Mrs. Donahue would have said it. It was said the way you say the sky is wide or the river runs deep, as a fact that requires no judgment. She looked away first. Which was also unusual. The fourth Saturday in May, Patterson sent most of the outfit into Caldwell for supplies and to take the afternoon, which was his way of acknowledging that men worked better if occasionally they had a day to breathe. Tamaz and Cleet went together. DeVoe had quit 2 days earlier after a disagreement with Patterson about his wages. Irene and Gideon rode in separately, and then found themselves at the same general store, and then found themselves walking down the same dusty street in the same direction, which was how they ended up at the small lunchroom that served hot food on Saturdays. The lunchroom was run by a woman named Bess Harding, who was wide and warm and competent, and who greeted Irene with a nod that held no judgment in it, which Irene appreciated. Most women in Caldwell greeted her with the particular tightness around the eyes that meant they had heard things or made up things and were deciding what to do with them. They sat at a table by the window and ordered the stew, which was beef and turnips and onion, and it was hot and good after a long week of camp cooking. Outside, the town moved in its Saturday way, horses at the rails, children running, women in bonnets and men in hats, the whole social machinery of a frontier town turning over on its weekly crank. "Penny for your thoughts," Gideon said. She looked at him. He had cleaned up for town, shaved, brushed the dust from his coat, and the effect was startling in a way she had not been prepared for, because he was, she saw now without the buffer of distance and daily work, quite genuinely handsome. It was an open face, the kind that had been shaped by weather and experience into something more interesting than conventional good looks. "I was thinking about what Mrs. Donahue said when I first rode in," Irene said, deciding to be honest because she generally was, "that I was too rough for decent society." Gideon picked up his spoon and looked at it. "What do you think about that?" "I think decent society has never done a single useful thing for me or anyone I loved," she said. "So I find it hard to be broken up over not being welcome in it." He looked up at her then, and something moved in his expression, something like recognition, the look of a man who has heard said out loud a thing he has thought for a long time. "Decent society didn't do anything for me either," he said quietly. "Decent society watched my mother work herself to exhaustion while my father drank and called it suffering for the cause. Decent society told me at 18 that I had no future worth counting because I came from nothing and had nothing. Decent society is very good at looking down at the people it's already ground under its boot and calling them rough." The words came out with a feeling that was controlled but real, the way a spring comes up from underground, quiet but with pressure behind it. Irene was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly it." They looked at each other across the table in the noisy lunchroom with the smell of stew and wood smoke around them, and something settled between them, some understanding that was more than just shared circumstance, though it was that too. It was the recognition of two people who had made themselves out of difficulty and chosen to do it without bitterness, which is not nothing. It is, in fact, quite rare. They walked back to their horses afterward and stood for a moment in the dust of the main street with the afternoon light going long and golden. Around them, Caldwell moved and murmured. "I'd like to walk with you again sometime," Gideon said. He said it plainly, without pretension, the way he said most things. Irene looked at him for a moment. The light was in his eyes and he did not look away from it. "All right," she said. She mounted up and rode ahead of him out of town, and she did not let herself smile until she was a quarter-mile out and the prairie had swallowed up the sound of Caldwell behind her. When she did smile, it was not a small smile. It crept up from somewhere that had not been used in a while, and it felt strange and good, like circulation returning to a numb limb. June came in warm and dry, which meant the work on the Patterson ranch was constant and full. The horses she had been hired to break were finished by the middle of the month, all 7 of them gentled and responsive. And Patterson hired her on as a regular hand because he was not a foolish man and he recognized good work. Gideon worked the cattle's side, and they crossed paths daily in the way of people who share a piece of land, and each crossing was a small and pleasant thing, a word exchanged, a look shared, the accumulation of small moments that become something larger without anyone declaring that it has. She learned things about him. He read when he could find books, which was not often, but he had a dog-eared copy of a short novel called The Deerslayer that he'd carried for 3 years, and he had opinions about it. He could not carry a tune, but he knew all the words to more songs than she did, which she found inexplicable and charming. He had a horse named Judge, who was the best-natured animal she had ever encountered, a steady, good-humored red dun who seemed to understand that his job was to be calm and did it without complaint. He learned things about her. She could read the sky for weather better than any of the older hands, and she was right about it more often than not, which Patterson had come to rely on quietly. She wrote letters sometimes on Sunday evenings, sitting outside the bunkhouse in the last of the light, writing to a woman named Clara who had been her mother's friend, and who now lived in Missouri and represented the only family she had left. She did not talk much about her feelings, but when she did, the words were precise and true, the way her actions were, with no filler and no waste. One evening in late June, there was a thunderstorm that came in fast from the south, the kind that turned the sky green-black and came with wind and fury, and all the horses needed to be moved from the south corral to the barn before it hit. They moved together, she and Gideon, working the horses quickly and smoothly, no wasted motion, and the storm broke over them before they were entirely done, and they were both soaked in the space of 2 breaths. They got the last horse in and pushed the barn door shut against the wind and stood inside in the sudden quiet with rain hammering on the roof and lightning walking across the prairie outside. They were both dripping. The barn was warm with the breath of horses. The lantern Gideon had grabbed on the way and cast a steady amber glow. "That came fast," he said. "Told Patterson this morning it would," she said. He laughed. She had not heard him laugh like that before, full and uncalculated, and it changed his face in a way that made her chest do something inconvenient. "You did," he said. "He didn't listen." "He almost never does the first time," she said. "He listens the second time when I've been right again." Gideon looked at her in the lantern light. The rain was still fierce outside and the horses were restless but not panicked. They stood close together because the barn was narrow with all the horses in it. "Irene," he said. She looked at him. Something in the way he said her name, just the one word, her name, with a weight to it that had been building for weeks. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it plain." "Then say it," she said. "I think I'm falling in love with you," he said. "I've been trying not to because I didn't know if you'd want that, and because I'm not a man who's got much to offer beyond the work I can do and the kind of man I'm trying to be. But I think you should know it because it seems like the honest thing." The rain came down. The horses breathed. The lantern held steady. Irene Alden had not been told she was loved in a very long time, and the last time it had been said without this quality of simplicity and weight, without this plain courage. She felt something in her chest that she recognized distantly as the feeling she had when she had been doing this work for a long time and gotten very good at being alone and built the habits of solitude so efficiently that she almost forgot there was something else. Almost. "You are not nothing," she said, and her voice was steady. "A man who is trying to be good is not nothing. That is actually quite a great deal." He waited. "I think I'm falling in love with you too," she said. "I've been trying not to, for the same general reasons." He reached up and touched her face with one hand, his thumb against her cheekbone, and she let him, and she leaned into it slightly the way a horse leans into a kind hand, not from submission but from the recognition of something trustworthy. "All right," he said softly. "All right," she agreed. He kissed her, there in the warm barn with the storm breaking over the Kansas plain, and it was a careful, honest kiss. The kind that is asking a question and receiving an answer at the same time, and it tasted like rain and worked days, and something that neither of them had quite expected to find. The storm moved on by morning. The sky was washed clean and the grass was green and the horses were calm in their stalls. And when Irene came out of the bunkhouse in the first light, Gideon was already at the fence with a cup of coffee, and he looked at her, and she looked at him. And they both smiled, and that was also something new, that someone was there at the fence with coffee, and a smile that was meant for her specifically. She crossed the yard and he handed her the cup and she drank from it because it was too early to be complicated about coffee, and he leaned on the fence beside her, and they watched the morning come up over the eastern plain, turning the grass gold by degrees. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. It was, she thought, one of the best mornings she had had in a considerable time. They were careful with it. Neither of them was the kind of person who made declarations in public or performed affection for an audience. What they had between them was built in the spaces between work, in the evenings when they walked the fence line together, in the Saturdays when they rode into Caldwell side by side and ate at Bess Harding's lunchroom and talked about everything and nothing. It was built in the slow accumulation of knowing someone, the kind of knowing that goes past the surface and finds the structure underneath. Patterson knew. Cleet knew. Tamaz knew and said nothing, but looked at them with a kind of quiet approval that was touching in someone so young. Even Bess Harding at the lunchroom seemed to know, and she began setting the same corner table for them without being asked. What also happened, as July edged toward August, was that Caldwell noticed. Caldwell was small enough that it noticed most things, and two people like Irene Alden and Gideon McCree, who were already notable for different reasons, were notable together in a way that the town could not resist commenting on. The commentary came to Irene directly one afternoon in early August when she came into Donahue's general store for thread and salt and encountered Mrs. Florence Donahue in the company of two other women from the ladies' auxiliary, a Mrs. Garvey and a Mrs. Price, who both had the look of women who had been rehearsing a conversation. "Miss Alden," Mrs. Donahue said, "I wonder if I might say something to you." "You generally do," Irene said, measuring out her salt. Mrs. Donahue pressed on. "It is our understanding that you have been keeping company with the McCree man from the Patterson outfit." "That's right," Irene said. "We feel," Mrs. Donahue said, with the weight of an institution behind her, that Mr. McCree might benefit from the company of a woman with more settled prospects and a more conventional history. Irene set down her scoop. She looked at Mrs. Donahue. She looked at Mrs. Garvey. She looked at Mrs. Price. All three looked back with the unified expression of people who have decided they are doing someone a favor. "Do you know what I've done in the last 3 months?" Irene said. "I've gentled 7 horses that no one else on that ranch could touch. I've predicted every major weather event within 48 hours. I've earned my wage and lived cleanly and caused no trouble. And in my free time, I've been keeping company with a man who is honest, hardworking, and kind, which is considerably more than most people in any society can claim for themselves." The 3 women were very still. Decent society, Irene said, keeping her voice level and even, has never done a single thing for me. It did not comfort me when my mother died. It did not offer me work when I needed work. It has not protected me or provided for me or given me one useful thing. What it has done consistently is tell me that I am not doing it right, not dressed right, not quiet enough, not small enough, not soft enough. She picked up her salt. So I'll let Gideon McCree make his own decisions about my company, and you can direct your concerns towards someone who asked for them. She paid for her things and left. She was 100 yards down the street before she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Gideon there, which was a surprise because she had not known he was in town. "I came in for nails," he said, looking at her carefully. "Heard most of that through the door." She lifted her chin. And, he said, "that was just about the finest thing I've ever heard anyone say in a general store." She laughed despite herself, and he fell into step beside her, and they walked back to their horses together in the August heat. "Does it bother you," she asked, "what people say about it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Does it bother you?" "I've thought about it," she admitted. "Not for my sake. For yours. People talk, and sometimes talk costs a man things." He stopped walking. She stopped too and faced him. They were standing in the street with the sun coming straight down and the dust around them and all of Caldwell doing its business around them, and he looked at her with that steady, serious look he got when he was being most completely himself. "Decent society never did a thing for either of us," he said. "You just said it. I've believed it for years. I am not going to let the opinion of people who don't know you or me tell me who to love." The words settled between them in the warm air. "Love," she said. "Love," he confirmed without flinching. "I told you back in June. I haven't changed my mind. Have you?" She thought about the mornings at the fence and the evenings at the fence line and the Saturday afternoons at Bess Harding's table and the barn and the storm and every small, honest building thing between them. "No," she said. "I haven't." He took her hand there in the street, which was not a small thing in 1878 in a small Kansas town, and she let him, and they walked back to their horses together and rode home. After that, they did not hide from the opinion of the town. They did not perform anything for the town either. They were simply themselves, which was apparently already too much for some people and just right for others. Bess Harding fell firmly in the latter category and told Irene one Saturday in August that she was glad to see her happy, and that she had always thought the ladies' auxiliary were a flock of geese dressed up in silk. Irene liked Bess Harding very much. August brought heat that sat on the land like a weight, and the work became harder in it, the ground dry and hard, the horses irritable with the heat and the insects. But in the evenings it cooled, and those evenings were wonderful. They would sit outside after supper, she and Gideon, and talk about things that neither of them talked about much with anyone else, the way two people do when they have decided to trust each other with the interior rooms of themselves. He told her about his father, the way the war had broken him, not heroically but quietly and meanly, the way it broke a lot of men who came home with their causes dead, and their pride rotted and nowhere to put either. He told her about leaving Georgia and the particular loneliness of the trail, the beauty of it and the hardness of it, and the way it made you small against the land in a way that was sometimes terrifying and sometimes the most peaceful thing in the world. She told him about her mother and the farm in Missouri, the particular education of watching a woman make something functional and even beautiful out of what she had been left with, which was not much. She told him about the ranches she had worked and the people she had met, good and bad and mixed, and the way she had learned what she needed to know from all of them. She told him that she had thought for a long time that she would be alone, not because she wanted to be, but because she had not believed that she could find someone who would look at who she actually was and not require her to be less of it. He listened to all of it. He did not try to solve it or soften it. He just listened. "You don't have to be alone," he said one evening, when she had run out of words and the stars were very thick above them and the crickets were loud in the grass. "You never did. You just hadn't met the right person." She looked at him in the dark. "Are you the right person?" "I'm trying to be," he said. "I think I might be. I think we might be right for each other." She reached over and took his hand in the dark. He turned his palm up and held hers. "I think so too," she said. "In September, a thing happened that changed the shape of everything. A man came through Caldwell looking for Gideon McCree. His name was Burl Watts, and he was a heavy-set man with a red face and a manner that was all belligerence and grievance. And he arrived on a Thursday afternoon and went straight to the saloon and announced that he was looking for the man who had cheated him out of wages on a cattle drive 3 years back, and he intended to settle the matter. Patterson heard about it within the hour because Caldwell was small, and he told Gideon that evening over supper, and Gideon went very still in a way that Irene had not seen before. "Do you know him?" Patterson asked. "I know of him," Gideon said. "He worked a drive I was on in 1875. He was let go by the trail boss for stealing from the other hands. He's told the story different since, apparently." "He's telling it very different," Patterson said. "He's saying you ran off with money that was his." Gideon shook his head. He was calm, but it was the kind of calm that is working to hold something. "That's a lie." "I know it is," Patterson said. He looked at Gideon steadily. "I've known enough men to know a liar's story when I hear one, but he's in town and he's loud, and in a few days people will have heard enough of it that they'll need a reason to disbelieve it." "I can go talk to him," Gideon said. "You could," Patterson said, "or he could go away on his own." "He won't," Irene said. She had been listening. Both men looked at her. "Men like that don't go away on their own. They need something to go away from." She was thinking. She had a way of being very still when she was thinking that made her look patient, but was actually the opposite, was the focused attention of someone moving very fast on the inside. "There was a trail boss," she said to Gideon. "On that drive. Where is he now?" Gideon thought. "A man named Hollies, Reuben Hollies. He's got a place outside of Wichita now. He let Watts go himself. He'd know the truth of it." "Can you get word to him?" she asked. "I can write him," Gideon said. "Do it tonight," she said. "And in the meantime let me go and speak to Burl Watts." Both men looked at her with the particular expression of men who are trying to decide whether to object and are not sure they have the authority. "Irene," Gideon said. "I'm not going to start anything," she said. "I'm going to end it, or at least slow it down." She looked at him, and he could see in her eyes that this was one of those moments where she was being exactly who she was, steady and direct and unafraid in a way that was not recklessness but genuine courage. "Let me." He nodded. He did not like it, but he trusted her. She rode into Caldwell that evening and found Burl Watts in the saloon, which was called the Prairie Star, and was a plain wooden building with a bar and 4 tables and a piano that was perpetually slightly out of tune. Watts was at the bar with 2 drinks in front of him, and a grievance that he had been polishing for 3 years and was very proud of. Irene sat down 2 stools away from him. He looked at her the way men who have their minds full of one thing look at something unrelated, with a distracted dismissal. "You looking for trouble?" she asked. He looked again, more carefully this time. "I'm looking for a man." "I know who you're looking for, and I know the real story of why you were let go from that drive," she said. "A man named Reuben Hollies will confirm it in writing, and that letter will be in Caldwell inside of 2 weeks. And this is a town that has a sheriff." She paused. "It also has a newspaper, which ran a story last spring about a man in the next county who arrived in town with a false complaint against an honest working man and ended up in front of a judge. So I'd think carefully before you keep telling your story, because the truth has a way of catching up, and it's already been written for and is on its way." None of this was entirely true. The letter was real, or would be. The newspaper story she had invented, but convincingly, because the principle was real enough. Burl Watts looked at her for a long moment. His face went through several things. "Who are you?" he said. "I'm nobody you want to cross," she said simply. She rode back to the ranch in the dark. She told Gideon what she had done. He was quiet for a moment. "You made up part of that," he said. "The part about the newspaper," she said. "The rest was true." "Part about the letter was only partly true. I haven't sent it yet." "Then send it," she said. He looked at her in the lamplight. "Irene." "He'll think about it," she said. "Men like that are bullies. Bullies calculate odds. I gave him a different set of odds to calculate." He shook his head slowly, but he was smiling the way he smiled when she had done something that was entirely herself, and he was still deciding how to feel about how much he admired it. He sent the letter the next morning. Burrow Watts was gone from Caldwell by the following afternoon. He did not come back. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from Reuben Hollies in Wichita, confirming every word Gideon had said about the 1875 drive, and including several additional unflattering details about Burrow Watts's character and conduct. Patterson read it, nodded, and filed it away in his desk, which was where things that might be needed later went. October came in with a cold that was real and a beauty that was also real, the prairie going gold and rust, and the sky going the deep blue of autumn. It was one of Irene's favorite times of year on open land, when everything had a clarity to it, the lights sharp and clean, the distances clear. One afternoon in early October, riding back from checking the water source on the east end of the property, she and Gideon stopped on a low rise from which you could see a very long way in every direction, the grass running to the horizon in every quarter, the sky enormous above it, and she thought, not for the first time, that this kind of country could make you understand what it meant to be small, and also what it meant to be part of something larger than yourself. "I've been thinking," Gideon said. She waited. "I've been thinking about what I want," he said, "not just for the season, for my life." She looked at the horizon. "And what do you want?" "I want land," he said. "I've been saving for it. Not a lot of land, not yet, but a start. Enough for a house and some horses and room to grow something." He paused. "And I want you in it if you want to be. I'm not asking you to be different or smaller or more of any particular thing. I'm asking for you, the way you are, who you are." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the same horizon she had been looking at, and his profile in the October light was as familiar to her now as her own hands, as known and as trusted. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said. He looked at her then. "Yes," he said, "I am." She thought about it and thought about it, and while she was thinking about it, she felt all the old solitudes rising up and asking if this was wise, if it was safe, if it could hold, the way she always second-guessed good things because good things had sometimes not been reliable. And then she thought about the barn in the storm and the mornings at the fence and every honest word he had ever said to her, and every way he had seen her exactly as she was and not asked her to change one particle of it. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." He let out a breath that had something in it, a long-held breath, the breath of a man who has been hoping for something and not quite let himself believe in it. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, the way he had taken it in the street in August, simply and completely, and the wind came across the prairie and the horses were still and the sky was enormous above them. "All right then," he said. "All right," she agreed, and she was smiling, and the smile was enormous, the kind that does not have a ceiling on it. They were married in November in the small church at the edge of Caldwell. It was not a society wedding. The preacher was a quiet man named Reverend Booth who asked them sensible questions and listened to their sensible answers and pronounced them married with a directness that suited both of them. Patterson was there, and Tamaz and Cleet and Bess Harding, who cried in the satisfied way of someone who had seen something good happen and had been rooting for it. There were no ladies' auxiliary members present, but Mrs. Donahue walked past the church on her way to the dry goods and looked in through the window, and what she saw was a woman who had been called too rough for decent society, standing at an altar in a plain dress the color of winter wheat, holding the hands of a lean, dark-haired man who was looking at her with an expression so openly full of love that even Mrs. Donahue, standing in the cold outside a church window she had no business looking through, felt something shift in her chest. She did not say anything about it at the next ladies' auxiliary meeting, but she did not say anything against Irene Alden again either. The wedding supper was at Bess Harding's lunchroom, which Bess had closed to the public for the afternoon and decorated with dried autumn flowers from the prairie. She cooked a proper meal, roast beef and fresh bread and a pie that was extraordinary, and they sat around Bess's biggest table and ate and talked and laughed, And it was small, and it was warm, and it was entirely right. They spent their first night as a married couple in the small room at the back of the lunchroom that Bess had offered them, because they did not yet have a house of their own, and the room was plain and warm and the bed was good. And Irene lay awake for a long while after Gideon had fallen asleep, listening to his breathing and looking at the ceiling and feeling the extraordinary weight of happiness, which is different from its surface presentation, which is that it is light, because it is not light at all. It is substantial. It is the weight of something real. In the spring of 1879, they had enough money combined, his 4 seasons of savings and hers, to put down on a small piece of land 8 miles east of Caldwell. The land was 160 acres, which under the Homestead Act could be claimed for a filing fee and 5 years of improvement, and Gideon had been working toward this since before he had known about Irene, and now he worked toward it with her. The land had a creek running through the southern quarter and good grass and 2 cottonwood trees that had been growing for a very long time and were enormous and beautiful. And the house they built was small and plain, and took most of the spring to finish with help from Patterson and Tomas, who came out on Sundays when the ranch work allowed. Building the house together was one of the best things Irene had ever done. She had expected to love the result, and she did. But she had not expected to love the process quite so much, the dailiness of it, the problem-solving, the slow accumulation of something from nothing. She and Gideon worked together with the same natural efficiency they had always had, the fit of 2 people who think similarly about practical problems and do not waste motion. By summer, they had a house, a small barn, 4 horses, a milk cow, a kitchen garden that Irene tended with the same focused intensity she gave to everything, and a life that was theirs. Gideon took work where he could find it to supplement what the land provided, and Irene continued breaking horses for other ranches on a contract basis, riding out when she was needed, and coming home to the house on the creek. And coming home was the part she had not expected to love as much as she did. She had not had a home in a very long time. She had places she slept and places she worked, but a home was different. A home was a place that knew you, and this one was learning them, and they were learning it. By the fall of 1879, Patterson's ranch had grown, and he needed a permanent hand who knew cattle, and he offered Gideon a foreman position at better wages than he had ever earned, which Gideon accepted on the condition that he could still work his own land when the ranch could spare him. Patterson accepted this because he was not a foolish man, and Gideon had become the best man he had on the outfit. Irene was building a reputation. Word travels in ranching country, and word about a woman who could gentle the worst horses in 3 counties had traveled considerably. She was not without critics. There were men who hired her, and then spent the first day watching with crossed arms and the intention of being unimpressed, and most of them were impressed by the end of the first day, because the work spoke for itself, and the work was extraordinary. She was fair with her fees and reliable in her commitments, and she built a clientele that ran from small ranches to large ones, and she loved the work as much as she ever had. Gideon watched her work whenever he could. He had a way of watching her that she found she did not mind, because there was no ownership in it, no performance of pride. It was just admiration, real and uncomplicated. In the winter of 1879, she found that she was pregnant. She told Gideon on a Sunday morning in December when the snow was coming down outside the window, and the house was warm with the wood stove going and the smell of coffee everywhere. He was very still for a moment when she told him. Then he looked at her with something in his face that she recognized as the same thing she felt, which was a complicated wonder, the wonder of a life that had already exceeded what either of them had expected, being about to exceed it further. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. "More than fine. Are you all right?" He laughed, the full, uncalculated laugh she loved. "I'm more than fine," he said. He stopped. He shook his head. "I don't have the words." She crossed the room and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and outside the snow came down on the Kansas plain, whitening the grass and the cottonwood trees and the whole winter landscape. "We're going to be all right," she said. "We are," he said. "We already are." The pregnancy was not easy because she was not the kind of woman who did things easily, which was both a strength and a complication. She kept working longer than anyone expected her to, which was a source of comment in Caldwell where comment on Irene Alden had never quite stopped, and she adjusted her work as she needed to, which was entirely practical and nobody's business but her own. Gideon was attentive without being hovering, which was the exact right calibration for her, and she told him so, and he said he had been paying attention to who she was for long enough to know that she needed support without restriction, and that was what he intended to give her. In July of 1880, their son was born, a boy they named Thomas Daniel McCree, Daniel for Gideon's grandfather, who had been a good man by all accounts. Thomas was loud and healthy, and had his father's dark hair and his mother's gray-green eyes, and he arrived in the world with an announcement about his preferences that suggested he had opinions, which Irene found appropriate. Gideon held the baby that first evening with the careful intensity of a man who has been given something precious and knows it, and does not want to overstate it or understate it but just wants to hold it right. He looked at Irene over the baby's head with an expression that was completely unguarded, all of him visible, all the love and the wonder and the gratitude. "Look what we did," he said softly. "Look what we did," she agreed. She was very tired and also very happy, and she fell asleep within the hour, and when she woke in the middle of the night, Gideon was still up, sitting in the chair by the window with the baby against his chest and the moonlight coming in over the prairie, and he was talking very quietly to the baby, telling him about the land and the horses and the creek and the cottonwood trees, telling him in a low and patient voice all about the world he had come into. And Irene lay still and listened and felt something that was beyond what words usually covered. Thomas grew, children do. He was robust and curious and had a remarkable tolerance for horses, which was just as well, given who his parents were. By the time he was walking, he was already interested in the corral, and by the time he was talking in full sentences, he had opinions about the horses by name, and Irene spent a great deal of time explaining to him, very seriously, that horses had feelings and needed to be respected, and he listened with the focused gravity of a child who is taking something important to heart. The years between 1880 and 1883 were full years, good years. The kind that you do not fully appreciate while they are happening because you are too busy living them to hold them still and look at them, but which you understand later, in retrospect, to have been the years that were the core of a life. The land they had filed on under the Homestead Act was producing. They had added more horses, and Gideon had purchased several cattle with a view to building a small herd. The house had grown by one room, which Gideon built in the winter of 1881, so there would be space for Thomas and for whatever came after Thomas. What came after Thomas in the spring of 1883 was a daughter, who arrived as suddenly and decisively as a summer storm, and was named Della after Irene's mother. She had Irene's coloring and her father's steadiness, and from the very beginning she was a settled and watchful child, which struck everyone who met her as remarkable, given who her parents were. Irene looked at her daughter on the morning she was born, and thought about her own mother, Della Alden, who had worked the Missouri farm alone and passed on to her daughter everything that mattered, the work ethic and the practical intelligence and the refusal to be diminished. She thought about how much her mother would have loved this, the house and the land and Gideon and Thomas and now this daughter with her name. She cried, which was unusual for her, and she let Gideon see it, which was more unusual still, and he held her hand and did not say anything because he understood that some things did not need words, that some things were just felt and acknowledged and held. Caldwell grew in those years. More settlers, more businesses, more of the apparatus of civilization that the frontier was building in its fitful and complicated way. The cattle drives through the Kisham Trail were slowing as the railroads pushed further west and the open range gave way to fenced land, and a way of life that had defined the previous decade was shifting into something new. It was 1883 and the Wild West, the version that had seemed lawless and permanent, was already becoming something different, something more settled and more complicated. Irene felt this as a change in the air, the way she felt weather. It was not a bad change precisely, but it was a change, and change on the frontier had always had both sides. The settlement brought schools and doctors and law, which were good things, genuinely good things for most people. But it also brought the carrying of old social structures west, the same structures that had always worked to keep certain people in certain places, and she felt that too. One afternoon in the fall of 1883, Bess Harding came out to the homestead, which was unusual, because Bess was deeply tied to her lunchroom and rarely left it during business hours. She came in her buggy with a purpose that was visible in the set of her shoulders, and Irene met her in the yard. "Something's happened," Irene said. "There's a meeting tonight," Bess said. "Town council. They're talking about passing a law that would limit who can operate a business in Caldwell. The way it's written would affect anyone who's not a permanent resident of the town itself. They say it's about order, but I know what it's really about, because I was in the meeting where Garvey and Price suggested it." She looked at Irene with her wide, warm face set in an expression of solid anger. "It's about you. It's about keeping the horse work you've been doing for ranches around here from being formalized, because they don't want a woman doing that work under a legal business agreement." Irene was quiet for a moment. "When is the meeting?" "7 tonight," Bess said. Gideon heard this from the barn doorway where he had been listening. He came out. He had Thomas on his hip because it was that time of afternoon when he was often carrying the boy around while doing small tasks. He looked at Irene. "We go," he said. "We go," she agreed. They arranged for Tomas, who had long since left the Patterson outfit and was now running his own small operation a few miles away, to sit with the children. They rode into Caldwell in the evening light, arriving at the small building where the town council met, which was also the building where court was held when the circuit judge came through. There were perhaps 30 people there, the usual contingent of town business owners, the ranchers who had interests in what Caldwell decided, and the ladies' auxiliary in force. The meeting was conducted by a man named Alderman Voss, who was in his 50s, and had the manner of someone who enjoyed procedure and used it as a shield. He read the proposed ordinance in a droning voice that made it sound bureaucratic and therefore inevitable, and then he asked for comment. Irene stood up. There was a moment of collective reaction in the room, a drawing in, a series of expressions that ranged from interest to discomfort to outright hostility. She spoke clearly and without hurry. She spoke about the work she had done, the ranches she had served, the specific horses she had worked with and the specific outcomes, speaking to the ranchers in the room in language they understood, because it was the language of results, of economics, of work done well. She spoke about the rights of free people in a free country to conduct honest work and make honest agreements, which in 1883 was language that had weight, that connected to the still-living memory of a war that had been fought over who was free and who was not. She spoke about what the frontier had always been, which was a place where a person's worth was measured by what they could do, not where they came from or what they looked like, or how closely they fit the expectations of people who had nothing to gain from their success. And she said, finally, directly, "I have been called too rough for decent society since the day I rode into this town. I have decided that decent society, as practiced in Caldwell, has never done anything for me or for most of the people in this room who have actually built something here with their hands. This ordinance is not about order. It is about limiting the competition of anyone who does not fit the pattern that certain people have decided is acceptable. I ask this council to vote it down." She sat down. Gideon was sitting beside her. He looked straight ahead, but she felt his hand find hers under the table and hold it. The vote that followed was not unanimous. Alderman Voss and 2 other council members voted in favor of the ordinance. 3 others voted against it. The deciding vote was cast by a council member named Jonas Hatch, who owned the largest cattle operation in the county and who had hired Irene twice to work his worst horses and had never been anything other than satisfied. He voted against the ordinance and did it without ceremony, looking at no one in particular. The ordinance failed. It would have been a small thing to the historical record, a minor moment in a minor council meeting in a minor Kansas town. But it was not a small thing to Irene Alden McCree, who had stood up in a room full of people who had decided what she was and had told them simply and completely that they were wrong. They rode home under a clear sky full of stars, and the night was cold and still, and the horse's breath came in clouds. "You were magnificent," Gideon said. "I was clear," she said. "There's a difference." "You were both," he said. She was quiet for a moment, riding beside him in the dark. "I keep wondering if it will ever stop, the having to prove it, the having to stand up and say it." He was quiet too. Then he said, "I don't know, I hope it stops. I think it gets easier, not because the world changes as fast as it should, but because you get more certain of yourself as you go, and certainty has a way of changing how people respond to you." She thought about that. "You sound wise." "I learned it from watching you," he said. She laughed, and the sound of it went out across the dark prairie, and the horses moved steadily, and they rode home together. Christmas of 1883 was the best one either of them could remember. The house was warm and the children were there, and Thomas, who was 3, had developed a philosophy about the whole enterprise that involved being present for every stage of every preparation in case anything interesting was going to happen. Della, at 6 months, was largely interested in her own hands and the faces of people who leaned over her, but she had a particularly delighted expression for her father, which Gideon had noticed and which secretly thrilled him. Bess Harding came for Christmas dinner, and Tomas and his wife, a young woman named Marisol whom he had married in the autumn, came as well. It was a full table and a warm room and the smell of roasting meat and fresh bread, and Irene looked around the table at these people who were her people, not the people she had been born into, but the people she had found and built with, and she felt a fullness that was so complete it was almost difficult to hold. After supper, when the children had been settled and Bess and Tomas and Marisol had gone home, and the house was quiet with the particular quiet of a place that had just been full of people, Irene and Gideon sat by the wood stove with the fire going low and their coffee going cold, because neither of them had drunk it and neither of them minded. "Are you happy?" she asked him. It was not the kind of thing she asked often, because she was generally more comfortable observing than asking, but it was Christmas and the room was warm and he was beside her, close enough that his shoulder was against hers. He considered the question with the seriousness she had always liked about him, the way he did not give quick answers to questions that deserved real ones. "I am," he said. "I am happier than I thought was available to me. I thought for a long time that happiness was something that happened to people who started with more than I did. I think I was wrong about that. I think happiness is something that gets built, out of work and honesty and the right person." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "The right person," she said. "The right person," he confirmed. He pressed his lips to the top of her head, easy and familiar, the gesture of a man who has been doing this for 5 years and intends to do it for 50 more. "I was told I was too rough for decent society," she said, not with bitterness, just with the observation of something that had once felt like a wound and now felt like a fact she had moved considerably past. "Decent society was never the point," he said. "The point was finding the life that fit the person you actually are. And did I find it?" He looked down at her and she looked up at him, and the fire went quiet and the house was still, and outside the Kansas winter lay across the plain, cold and clear and wide. "Yes," he said. "I think you found it. I think we both did." The years that followed were not without difficulty, because life on the frontier in the 1880s did not run smooth by any measure, And there were seasons of drought and seasons of fierce cold, and the ordinary difficulties of raising children and running land and doing work that mattered. But the difficulties were not beyond them, because they had built the kind of partnership that could hold up to difficulty, the kind that is made of two people who have looked at the worst they can offer each other and decided to stay and keep building. Thomas grew into a boy who was, as Irene had suspected from the very beginning, full of opinions and full of enthusiasm, and full of a love of horses that was so complete it seemed less like a preference and more like a calling. By the time he was 5, he was following his mother around the corral the way she had once followed her own mother around the Missouri farm, learning the work the way children learn the things that matter most, not from formal instruction but from proximity and attention, and the deep cellular understanding that this is what the people you love do, therefore it is worth doing. Della grew into a child who was more contemplative, who watched and considered before she acted, who had a quality of stillness that was remarkable in someone so young, and that Gideon recognized as something she had gotten from her mother's better hours, the particular stillness of a woman who is thinking very fast on the inside. In the spring of 1885, Irene took on an apprentice, a girl of 18 named June Prater, who was the daughter of a small rancher and who wanted to learn horse work, and had heard about Irene McCree from 3 different directions. June was eager and capable and had good hands, and Irene taught her with the same patience and directness with which she did everything, and June learned quickly and well. The fact of Irene teaching another woman the work was not nothing. It was, in its quiet way, a thing that mattered because it meant the knowledge went forward, that the particular understanding she had built over years of working with horses would not stop with her. She felt this as significant in a way she did not talk about much, but Gideon saw it. "You're proud of her," he said one evening, watching June work a young horse in the corral. "I'm proud of what she's learning," Irene said. "Same thing," he said. She looked at him. "You always do that." "Do what?" "See the version of me that's more generous than the one I'm presenting," he smiled. "It's not more generous, it's more accurate." She shook her head, but she was smiling too. By 1886, the Homestead Act improvements on their 160 acres were more than satisfied, and the land was theirs outright, with the deed in Gideon's name as the law required, though they both thought of it as theirs and it operated as theirs in every practical way. The herd had grown. The horses Irene bred and trained had become locally famous in the way that good things become famous in contained communities, not with fanfare but with the steady accumulation of reputation. The name McCree, when applied to a horse, meant something specific, meant a horse that was well-started and even-tempered and reliable, which were excellent things for a horse to be. Caldwell had changed around them. The cattle drives through the Kisham Trail had essentially ended by the mid-1880s, as the railroads had pushed far enough west, and the range had been fenced enough that the old trail culture was finished. What had replaced it was more settled and more complicated, with land disputes and fence-cutting wars and the difficult politics of a region transitioning from open range to homestead. They were not untouched by this, because no one in the region was, but they had fenced their own land early and kept to themselves and kept their agreements, and the respect they had built over years of honest work held them in good standing with their neighbors. One afternoon in the summer of 1886, Mrs. Florence Donahue drove her buggy out to the McCree place. This was remarkable for several reasons, the most remarkable being that Mrs. Donahue had never in 8 years come to Irene Alden McCree with anything except criticism delivered from a distance. She arrived in the yard with a contained expression that was clearly the product of some internal effort, and Irene, who had been working in the kitchen garden, came out with soil on her hands and a look that was politely inquiring. "Mrs. McCree," Mrs. Donahue said. "Mrs. Donahue," Irene said. The two women looked at each other in the afternoon light. Thomas was in the corral with his father. Della was sitting on the porch steps with the focused gravity she brought to everything, watching her mother and the visitor. "I want to say something, Mrs. Donahue said, which was a sentence that, coming from her, had once meant the beginning of a correction. "All right," Irene said. "I've been thinking about it for some time," Mrs. Donahue said. "The things I said when you first came to town, and the things that were said at the ladies' auxiliary, and the ordinance in 1883. She paused. She was not a woman who found apology easy, and it showed, but she was pressing through it. "I was wrong. In the assessment I made of you and in the actions I supported. You have been nothing but a working, decent woman, and you have built something here that a great many people could learn from. And I said things about you that were not fair and not kind and not accurate, and I should have said this before now." Irene was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate that," she said. "I mean it. It takes something to say it." Mrs. Donahue's shoulders dropped slightly, some tension releasing. "I also wanted to say that the ladies' auxiliary is meeting next month, and we will be discussing the establishment of a lending library for the town. We hoped you might contribute some consideration if you have books to spare and perhaps attend." Irene almost smiled. "I'll think about it." Mrs. Donahue nodded, climbed back into her buggy, and drove away. Irene watched her go. From the porch, Della said in her 3-year-old voice, "Who was that lady?" "Someone who has been thinking things over," Irene said. Gideon had come to the corral fence and was watching. When Irene looked at him, he raised his eyebrows slightly, a question. "She apologized," Irene said, "more or less." He looked after the buggy. Then he looked back at Irene. "More or less?" "It was about 75% apology and 25% recruiting," she said. He laughed. "That sounds about right for Florence Donahue." Irene did attend the following month's ladies' auxiliary meeting for the lending library discussion, which was a practical thing worth supporting. She did not become a regular member of the auxiliary because she was too busy and because she and the auxiliary were, constitutionally, somewhat mismatched. But she donated 4 books, including the copy of The Deerslayer that Gideon had carried for years and had finally decided he did not need to carry any more because he had read it enough times to have it memorized, and she thought the gesture was appropriate in a way she could not fully articulate. The library was established. Thomas, when he was old enough, would use it constantly. Della would become one of its most devoted borrowers, developing a love of reading that was intense and private and beautiful. In the winter of 1887, Gideon came home one evening from a day at the Patterson Ranch looking different in some way she could not immediately place. He sat down to supper and ate and talked with the children and helped with their settling for the evening, and it was only after the children were asleep and she and Gideon were alone in the quiet kitchen that she said, "What is it?" He looked at her. "Patterson's selling the ranch," he said. "His health is not good. His sons are back east and not interested in coming out. He's going to sell it to a land company from Topeka and go live with his daughter in Kansas City." She absorbed this. Patterson and his ranch had been the context in which she and Gideon had found each other, had been the setting for the first winter and the first spring and the summer of the storm. It was not their livelihood anymore, not for some years, but it was part of the shape of their story. "How is he?" she asked. "He's tired," Gideon said. "He's ready. He asked about you, about us. He seemed glad." "We should go see him," she said. "I'd like that," Gideon said. They drove out to the Patterson Ranch the following Sunday, all 4 of them, Gideon and Irene and Thomas and Della, and they sat with Howard Patterson for an afternoon, in the house that had been his for 22 years, and drank coffee and let the children run in the yard and talked about the years that had passed and the ones ahead. Patterson was thinner than he had been, but his eyes were still sharp, and his manner was still direct, and he looked at Irene and Gideon with the particular expression of an old man who has watched something develop over many years and is satisfied with the outcome. "You 2 came out right," he said, which was about as sentimental as he got. "We had a good start," Gideon said. "A good place to find each other." Patterson nodded. He looked out the window at Thomas in the yard. "That boy's going to be a horseman. If he has anything to say about it," Irene said. Patterson smiled. He's got your look, that considering look, the one that means he's already decided what he's going to do and he's working out the details." Irene laughed. "Gideon says that too." "We're both right," Patterson said comfortably. They said goodbye to Howard Patterson in the late afternoon, with the last of the fall light going horizontal across the land, and he stood at the door of his house and watched them go, and Irene looked back once and saw him there, a solid shape against the light, and felt the particular tenderness of things that were real and were passing. Patterson sold the ranch in December and moved to Kansas City. He died the following spring peacefully in his daughter's house. Gideon and Irene received the letter and sat with it for an evening and talked about him, the particular way you talk about someone who has been important to your life, with gratitude and with the recognition of what has been given. Tamaz came by when he heard, and they sat together on the porch in the spring evening, he and Marisol and Irene and Gideon, and they remembered Patterson in the way that people remember good men, with stories that were not heroic but were true, the daily decencies of a man who had tried to be fair in a country that was not always fair and had mostly succeeded. "He gave us both a start," Gideon said. "He did," Tamaz said. He looked at Irene. "He told me once that when you rode in that first day, he thought he was making a mistake, and then he watched you with the horses for an hour and he thought he had done something exactly right." Irene smiled. "That sounds like him. He always said the horses were better judges than people." "He wasn't wrong," Gideon said. The spring of 1888 brought something they had not expected, which was an offer of real money for 3 of the horses Irene had bred and trained, from a buyer out of Wichita who had heard about the McCree stock and came down specifically to see it. He was a careful man named Alderson, and he looked at the horses with the eye of someone who knew what he was looking at and made an offer that was fair and generous. They negotiated over a morning, Irene and Alderson, while Gideon listened and occasionally said a number when Irene glanced at him for confirmation of her instinct. The negotiation was conducted with the respect of equals, which was what she had always wanted, and what she had largely built through years of making it impossible for people to do otherwise. They sold the 3 horses. The money was enough to build the second barn they had been planning, the one with proper stalls and a proper hayloft, and the kind of construction that would hold up to 20 Kansas winters without complaint. They built it that summer, with help from Tamaz and a man named Greaves who was a carpenter from Caldwell, and who, in the process of spending 2 months working alongside them, became a friend. The barn went up plank by plank in the summer heat, and Thomas, who was 8 now, helped with everything he was able to help with and understood that he was participating in something important, which he treated with a seriousness that was entirely his mother's. Della, at 5, had decided that the barn cat who had lived in the original small barn was her particular responsibility, and she spent a great deal of the summer trying to convince this cat, an ancient and self-possessed gray tom named Colonel, that he would be happier in the new building. Colonel was unconvinced and expressed his opinion with dignity. In the evenings of that summer, Irene would sometimes sit on the fence of the new barn's corral and watch the light go down over the land, the same land she had filed on with Gideon nearly a decade ago, and she would think about the distance traveled, not in miles, but in the kind of distance that is built year by year out of choices and work and love and stubbornness, and the refusal to become less than you are. The day she had ridden into Caldwell in 1878 with the dust storm behind her and the crow feather in her hat and the rifle across the saddle horn, she had been someone who had made herself out of necessity. She was still that person. That person had not gone anywhere. But she had become more than that person too, because you always become more when the conditions are right. She heard the door of the house open and Gideon's boots on the porch, and then his steps across the yard. He came and leaned on the fence beside her, the same fence-leaning posture he had had since the first mornings of their marriage, the posture of a man who is comfortable with a piece of land and with the person beside him. "Children are asleep," he said. "Good," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "What are you thinking about?" she considered, About how far we've come. He looked at the land and the last of the light. It's something, isn't it? It's considerable, she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, the way she always did, easy and familiar and still with the warmth in it that had been there from the beginning. Some things, she had discovered, do not wear away with use. Some things become more valuable the more they are used. Trust is one of those things. Chosen love is another. I'm glad you rode into Caldwell, he said. I'm glad you were there when I did, she said. Above them, the stars were coming up over the Kansas plain, the same stars they had watched on summer evenings when they were just starting, when everything was new and uncertain, and full of a future they had not yet built. The future was built now, mostly. It was here around them, in the house and the land and the barns and the horses and the children sleeping inside. It was built and it was solid and it was theirs. I love you, he said. He had said it 10,000 times in 10 years, in 10,000 different contexts, and it still meant the same thing it had meant the first time, which was everything. I love you, she said back. They stood at the fence in the summer dark, and the stars came out one by one over the plain, and the horses breathed in the new barn, and somewhere inside the house, Thomas turned in his sleep, and Della made a small sound and was still again, and the whole wide Kansas night held them in its enormous, quiet, indifferent way, and within it they were entirely at home. The years continued to be good years. June Prater, Irene's apprentice, established her own horse-breaking work by 1890 and had 3 clients within her first year, and she came to Irene and Gideon's house for Sunday dinners sometimes, and Irene watched her with the satisfaction of someone who has passed something forward. In 1891, Thomas turned 11 and declared with absolute certainty that he intended to be a horseman and a rancher, and Irene looked at this declaration with the seriousness it deserved and told him that was a fine ambition, and that he should work toward it with everything he had. And she taught him with the same methodical patience she had always applied to young horses and to young people, which was that patience and respect produce far better results than force. Della, at 8, was already reading at a level that astonished her teacher at the Caldwell school, and she had a particular interest in history and in the accounts of how things worked, the engineering of things, the logic of systems. She told her parents once, with the gravity of an 8-year-old who has been thinking about this carefully, that she thought the most interesting things were the ones where you could see how each part connected to the others. Irene thought this was an excellent way of thinking about the world and told her so. Gideon, in the fall of 1891, was offered the position of deputy sheriff by the town of Caldwell, because the sheriff, a man named Trent, knew his reputation and his character and the way he handled himself, and thought the county could use someone who was steady and honest and could ride. Gideon came home and told Irene, and they talked about it through a full evening, and the question was not whether he was capable, but whether it was what he wanted. He decided it was, because he had always believed that the law, when it was practiced well, was one of the few things that could actually protect people who otherwise had no protection, and he had seen enough of what happened when the law was practiced badly or not at all to want to contribute to it being done right. He took the position. He kept the homestead and the cattle and the horses alongside it, because they were not things to be given up. It meant more work and more responsibility, and he met both with the same even temper he brought to everything. Irene thought, watching him pin on the deputy's star on his first morning, that he had grown into himself fully now, the way good things do over time. He was 39 years old, and he was a man with weight and depth and quiet authority, and he was still the same man who had leaned on the fence with her in the early mornings of their marriage and looked at the land they were building together, and the continuity of that, the fact that he had become more of himself rather than something different, was one of the things she loved most. "You look the part," she said. "That's a start," he said. "Don't let it go to your head," she said. "You'll make sure of it," he said, and kissed her, and went out to the horse. In the spring of 1892, something happened that brought everything together in a way that felt, in retrospect, like the kind of moment that closes a long story. A letter arrived from Missouri, from a man who was the son of Irene's mother's old friend Clara, who was now gone. The letter said that Clara had left something for Irene, a small piece of land in Missouri that had been her mother Della's original farm, which Clara had bought at auction years ago when it had gone for taxes after Irene had left, and which she had held, improbably and faithfully, against the possibility of someday returning it to the person it had belonged to. Clara's son wrote that his mother had always said she was keeping it for Irene, and that now she was gone, he was honoring that intention. Irene sat with this letter for a long time, the Missouri farm, her mother's farm, the place she had learned everything. She showed Gideon the letter. He read it slowly and then he looked at her. "How do you feel?" "Like something has come back that I didn't think was coming back," she said. "Not the land itself, but," she stopped, "like a circle has closed. They talked about what to do with it. They did not want to move to Missouri. Their life was here in Kansas, rooted deep in this land and this town and these people. But the farm could be sold, or it could be leased to a tenant, and the money from it could go toward Thomas's future, toward the land he would need when he was old enough to start his own. They wrote back to Clara's son and made arrangements, and the farm in Missouri was leased to a family who would work it and care for it. And the lease money went into a savings account at the Caldwell Bank for Thomas Daniel McCree's future. Thomas, when he was told about this, received the information with the gravity of a boy who is beginning to understand that the world is longer than his own memory of it, that things began before him and will extend past him, and that he is part of a line of people and choices and work that runs in both directions. "Grandmother Della's farm," he said. "That's right," Irene said. He thought about it. "She would have wanted me to do something good with it." "Yes," Irene said. "She would have." Summer of 1892 was particularly beautiful, the kind of season that is almost too full of good things. Long golden days and warm nights and the land doing well and the children growing and the work going right. Irene and Gideon were both 41 and 38 respectively, and they had the ease of people who have been building something together for a long time and have built it solidly and know it. One evening they went out together on horseback, just the two of them, leaving the children with Marisol for the afternoon, and they rode out across the land until they were far enough from the house that the house was small behind them, and the land was enormous around them. And they rode slowly in the late afternoon light and talked about nothing much and everything much, the way they always had. They stopped on the same low rise where Gideon had asked her to marry him, 14 years earlier. She recognized it without having to think about it, recognized the particular angle of it and the view it offered, the grass running out in every direction, the sky impossibly wide. "I thought about you before I asked you," he said, looking at the horizon. "On this spot, what you would say." She looked at him. "What did you think I would say?" "I thought you might say no," he said. "Not because you didn't want it, but because you had gotten very good at doing without, and sometimes that is its own kind of lock." "You weren't wrong," she said. "I nearly did, not because I didn't want it, exactly because I did." He looked at her with that expression she knew completely, the one that was all of him, all the love and the directness and the quiet humor and the steadiness. "I'm glad you said yes," he said. "So am I," she said. "Every day." They rode back as the sun was going down, and the house was lit against the darkening sky, and Della's voice came across the yard as they rode in, high and clear, calling to Colonel the barn cat, who had apparently lived forever and was still making his own decisions. Thomas was at the fence, watching for them, the way he often did because he liked to know where people were, which was a quality he had from both of them. Gideon helped Irene down from her horse, the gesture easy and familiar, and she stood for a moment with her hand in his before she let go, because there was never a reason to hurry the letting go. "Good evening," he said. "Good evening," she said. Thomas came across the yard to take the horses, which he was entirely capable of doing and had been for 2 years, and he did it with the quiet competence of a boy who is growing towards something solid. Della abandoned her pursuit of Colonel and came running to her mother with the particular urgency of a 9-year-old who has thought of a question during the afternoon and has been saving it. Inside the house, supper was ready and the lamp was lit and the table was set, and they all sat down together in the lamplight, the four of them, around the table that Gideon had built in the second year of the homestead from timber they had ordered from Caldwell, a table that had been used for every meal and every conversation and every homework problem and every Sunday dinner since then. Irene looked around the table. Thomas, who had his father's dark hair and her gray-green eyes, and a quality that was entirely his own, a focused enthusiasm that lit up a room. Della, who was small and still and watchful and full of an inner life that was remarkable and that would take her somewhere interesting, wherever that turned out to be. Gideon, who was pouring coffee with the easy attention of a man entirely at home, who looked up at her across the table with the same eyes that had looked at her steadily across that lunchroom table in 1878, still direct, still warm, still exactly themselves. She had been called too rough for decent society. And decent society had never done a single useful thing for her or for the man she loved, both of which things were still true, and neither of which mattered any more in the way they once had, because this was what she had built instead. This table, this lamp, these people, this life on this land, hers and his and theirs together, built from nothing but work and honesty and the choice, made over and over every day since the storm in the barn, to trust the right person with the real self. Decent society had not built this. They had built this. Out of everything they were, exactly as they were, without apology and without diminishment. It was sufficient. It was more than sufficient. It was everything. The lamp burned steady in the Kansas evening, and the children talked, and the food was good, and outside the wide land lay quiet under the summer stars, holding them as it had always held them with its enormous, faithful, indifferent patience, and it was enough. It was all and entirely enough.